Hi, my name is Lauren Gant, and today I will be talking about the devastating 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the northern Gulf of Mexico, United States. The objectives of today's presentation are to provide a brief timeline of the event and the months following, map the extensive footprint of the spill, illustrate how millions of barrels of oil impacted the local animal life, and discuss the extent of oiled shoreline. We will be looking at a series of figures to better understand what happened and how this disaster left a lasting and devastating environmental impact. The first figure will provide a brief overview of the events following the initial explosion. Figure 2 will show where the disaster occurred. Figures 3 and 4 will demonstrate the effects on the local bottlenose dolphin and sea turtle populations. And finally, Figure 5 will illustrate the still great lengths of oiled shoreline 1 and 2 years after the spill. The Deepwater catastrophe on April 20, 2010 began with an explosion on BP's Macondo well, located about 1 mile below the ocean surface and 50 miles offshore. The blast resulted in the tragic loss of 11 workers and caused the oil platform to sink into the ocean. The damaged well released toxic oil into the northern Gulf of Mexico for a duration of 87 days before containment efforts successfully sealed it. In an initial attempt to prevent the oil from reaching the shoreline, Mississippi released a levee to flush the area with fresh water. This surge of fresh water was later linked to the loss of 8.3 million oysters. On April 28th, government agencies began setting controlled fires to burn off oil and slow the spread. In total, 411 controlled fires were intentionally set. Air pollution from the evaporation of compounds found in the oil and from the fires exposed air-breathing animals like dolphins and turtles to toxic fumes. Additional control efforts included physical attempts to siphon oil from the surface of the water, as well as the placement of floating booms. Chemical dispersants were released on the surface of the ocean and in the deep waters near the well to break up oil into tiny droplets. Despite these attempts, the oil continued to spread extensively, and by June, it had reached the shores of Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. Over the course of the spill, oil cumulatively spread through an area that exceeded 43,300 square miles of ocean. This map shows the cumulative footprint of the Deepwater oil spill. It ultimately spread across 1,300 miles of coastline along 5 states. The bottlenose dolphin population in the Gulf was severely affected by the spill. Air pollution from burning oil and oil vapors at the surface of the water caused damage to their lungs and airways. Further exposure through ingestion of contaminated prey and oil in the water resulted in an increase in bottlenose dolphin deaths in Barataria Bay, Louisiana, the Mississippi River Delta, the Mississippi Sound, and in Mobile Bay, Alabama. It was estimated after careful study that the mortality rates compared to the expected or baseline mortality rates were much higher after the spill. As shown in this graph, there was 35% excess mortality in Barataria Bay, 59% in the Mississippi River Delta, 22% in the Mississippi Sound, and 12% excess mortality in Mobile Bay, Alabama. Additionally, unborn dolphins from the northern Gulf were 18 times more likely to show signs of fetal distress than those from other areas. The sea turtle population took a huge hit as well. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimated in their damage assessment that the Deepwater disaster resulted in the deaths of between 4,900 and 7,600 large juvenile and adult sea turtles. The graph displayed here shows the breakdown of the number of large juvenile and adult sea turtles killed by the oil spill in the continental shelf areas. Additionally, between 55,000 and 160,000 small juvenile sea turtles, including Kemp's ridleys, green turtles, loggerheads, hawksbills, and other identified species, were also killed by the spill. Perhaps most concerning of all, response activities meant to restore the sea turtle population and the surrounding environment led to the injuries of nearly 35,000 sea turtle hatchlings. Although these numbers are staggering, sea turtles and bottlenose dolphins were far from the only animals affected by the spill. Fish, shellfish, birds, and more were significantly affected. Researchers determined that exposure to the oil resulted in a wide variety of adverse health effects, including reproductive issues and damage to internal organs, and led to the longest and largest unusual mortality event ever documented in the Gulf of Mexico. Response and restoration efforts began almost immediately. However, as displayed in this graph, extensive lengths of shoreline were still oiled 1 and even 2 years following the spill. Louisiana had the longest oiled shoreline by far compared to the other states, with an estimated 465.1 kilometers of oiled shoreline 1 year after the spill, and 347.2 kilometers of oiled coast 2 years after the spill. During the time between year 1 and year 2, the oiled lengths of shoreline fell only slightly in Florida and Mississippi, and actually increased from 91.4 kilometers to 95 kilometers in the state of Alabama. The response effort for this major environmental disaster was large and has lasted for over a decade. Multiple federal and state government agencies have been involved in the restoration efforts, along with environmental groups and thousands of volunteers. BP, the company responsible for the exploded oil rig, settled in court for $20.8 billion, with $8.8 billion due to the extensive damage to natural resources. Scientists have spent the last 14 years studying the environmental effects of Deepwater Horizon and will continue to study its devastating impact for many years to come.